Hello again. In today's video, I'll be attempting to answer the question, what does tempo mean? Tempo is a bit of jargon for trading card games that references the pace of the game. To explain it better, let's first look at the resources in Lorcana. We have three major resources in the game of Lorcana: cards, ink, and lore. There's an easy to understand advantage for each of these. Card advantage is having more cards than your opponent, giving yourself more potential resources. Ink advantage is having more ink in play, letting you take more game actions or just bigger game actions than your opponent. Lore advantage is simply having or gaining more lore than your opponent. Your deck's archetype is usually built to have a major focus on one of these advantages. Control decks are built to out-resource your opponent, often by drawing more cards than your opponent and by taking advantage of cards that clear the playfield. Aggro decks are trying to score 20 lore as fast as possible, and ramp decks are trying to put additional ink on the field to play bigger cards earlier than normal. This is a generalization. Decks can feel like a blend of these ideas, and cards can be so powerful at their purpose that they're run in multiple archetypes. Tempo is the flow of the play field as you make the choices to gain the advantages you want to gain. Good tempo is getting the most value out of each of your cards. It's about maximizing the use of your resources. More simply to measure, tempo is the potential impact of your cards in play. Let's look at an example by evaluating the tempo of various 3-cost cards you can play on turn 3. We'll look at Maleficent Sorceress, Mickey Mouse Detective, Cheshire Cat Not All There, and Mickey Mouse Steamboat Pilot. Steamboat Pilot will be the basic idea here to represent tempo, being a baseline for what stats we can get from a 3-cost character. Comparing our baseline to Maleficent, who offers us some card advantage by drawing a card when she comes into play, but by playing Maleficent, we're sacrificing some potential tempo in order to gain her card advantage. The impact of Maleficent's stats on the board is low, but she's valuable because of her effect, not her stats. She can't contribute much to the board when your opponent has a Steamboat Mickey that can challenge her and live. If given that opportunity, Mickey was able to remove your card without your opponent losing one of their own. Or Steamboat can sing or quest without worrying about being banished in a challenge. This is the tempo advantage of Steamboat Mickey. His stats in play have made Maleficent's body irrelevant to the board. Now we look at Detective Mickey and see a similar sacrifice, less stats to gain the effect of putting an additional ink into play. This extra ink is a tempo investment to hopefully catch up later by playing more impactful cards sooner than your opponent. But just like Maleficent, his body doesn't have the board impact that Steamboat Mickey does, so you've lost your immediate tempo in order to gain his effect. Last, we'll look at Cheshire Cat, a 3-cost 0/3 that quests for 2 with a strong ability that lets you always trade with the challenging character that banishes Cheshire. What makes Cheshire Cat a tempo disadvantage is that it can't challenge into opponents' characters, because Cheshire has 0 strength. You're committing to questing and won't have control over who has the board tempo advantage. Now all 3 of these cards see more play than Steamboat Mickey because their effects are worth the tempo cost. Maleficent and Mickey's body is relevant for challenging cheap characters, and their cost lets them sing important songs. Cheshire Cat can be difficult for certain decks to answer without trading a bigger character into it, thus losing tempo themselves. In Lorcana, tempo advantages come into play with this example in how you choose to quest or challenge. Sticking with just these cards versus Steamboat Mickey, if you quest with your Maleficent or Detective Mickey, you've chosen to make an aggressive play to gain lore and give your opponent the option to challenge in to gain board advantage. This is where you take the potential of the tempo you've invested and turn it into a resource. You can quest with your Steamboat Mickey to race lore, or you can challenge in, sacrificing some willpower to effectively gain card advantage while maintaining your board advantage. Or you might sing and effectively gain temporary ink advantage. This example shows tempo at the same cost, but gaining tempo is often done by trading lower cost resources with opponents' higher cost resources. Challenging Cheshire Cat with Captain Hook Forceful Duelist is an example of trading your low-cost resource for an opponent's higher-cost resource. This is a positive tempo trade. The prime example of tempo advantage is with cards like Mother Knows Best. Returning a character to your opponent's hand removes its potential tempo impact on the board but costs you card advantage. This showcases the importance of utilizing tempo to win before your opponent's advantages can matter. Now you have to take the tempo you've gained and turn it into a lore advantage before you run yourself out of resources. As we look at these examples, we can better define tempo in Lorcana as the advantage of options you have with the characters you have on the board. But we haven't yet articulated the impact of lore advantage on your tempo. Both players can fight for tempo advantage up until one player can win by questing. Once we reach this point, the options your characters on board have is reduced to answering the question, how do I stop my opponent from winning? Aggro decks will try to make their opponents answer this question as fast as possible. I think now we're at a better understanding of what tempo means and how it defines the pace of a game. Now it's time to better define value. We often see tempo compared to value as if they're opposites, but value is really the specific moment you choose to turn your tempo into an advantage. The most often time we see tempo compared to value in Lorcana is when we take an advantageous challenge, usually one where we remove our opponent's character from the board while keeping our own, when we instead could have quested or sung. This often used example of value is essentially card advantage. We've removed one of our opponent's cards while keeping our own, like our example with Steamboat Mickey. The cost of tempo here was reducing the potential impact our character can make in the future as it has less willpower and is now vulnerable to being challenged. This value choice is often in its context compared to making an aggressive play by questing. Truly, the safest way to protect our tempo is by doing nothing, reducing our opponent's choices to challenge our tempo. Sometimes this is the correct thing to do. Take a card like Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, for example, whose puny pirate ability lets you deal 2 damage to another character when she challenges and banishes a character. Her ability significantly reduces your opponent's choices with their characters. If they leave you a favorable trade, Tinkerbell has the potential to devastate their board. If you quest with Tinkerbell, you leave her vulnerable to being challenged and lose the potential impact she could have had on the game. But at some point you have to turn your tempo into some advantage. Gaining tempo is useless if you don't use it to try to win the game at some point. Like I said earlier, you lose all your tempo when you have to answer the question, how do I stop my opponent from winning next turn? You also lose all your value when you have to answer the same question. But back to our topic before this question gets asked. The moment you choose what to turn your tempo advantage into. A value play is turning our game tempo into card advantage. Focusing on establishing this position is what defines mid-range decks. Trading resources advantageously and finding opportunities to turn tempo into value while knowing when to switch to aggressive plays. Sometimes that's by trading, but it's also by establishing a board state that allows you to spend mana to gain advantages at the cost of tempo, without falling too far behind. The decision to pay 3 for friends on the other side, instead of putting a body on the board, can be detrimental to your tempo if you're not playing it in an advantageous position, or if you aren't just searching for one of your board clears. This bridges me to the next 2 topics around tempo and value, board resets and songs. Board resets, or board clears, cards like Be Prepared and Grab Your Sword, are the most impactful cards in combating tempo. Be Prepared completely resets the board advantage both players have worked for, and Grab Your Sword potentially destroys just your opponent's. When you're fighting for tempo, you have to be aware of these cards and get the most value out of your cards before these board resets come into play. An example would be making the aggressive play to quest instead of taking an advantageous challenge against Ruby Amethyst control if you think your opponent's best answer to the board is Be Prepared. I'm severely reducing the depth of the game state down to give that advice. You have to account for all the advantage battles happening in the game and what cards both players have access to in order to make the correct decision. But that varies from game to game. A board reset like Be Prepared has the potential to destroy your board tempo, but if your opponent just spends their turn clearing the board, you get to take the next game actions and restore your tempo advantage. It might be correct to establish a board that makes Be Prepared the best answer your opponent could play. If you don't commit enough, your opponent can instead fight the board with other cards like Maui, Hero to All, or Dragonfire. Now, Lorcana has something uniquely powerful in its design: songs. Songs are designed in mind with allowing you to sacrifice tempo by exerting a character in order to gain an ink advantage by playing the song for 0 instead of its full cost. This prevalent mechanic fundamentally changes the benefits of having a tempo advantage. You can benefit from your tempo advantage by playing a song, effectively turning tempo into ink, but you also need to be able to punish your opponent for exerting their characters to sing, which you can't do without characters in play. I'll withhold this opportunity to give you my opinion of the mechanic. Songs are a core mechanic tied to the flavor of the game itself. Songs are a defining part of Lorcana. Now, certain costed characters will threaten a larger potential impact on the game simply because they can sing some of the most powerful songs in the game. Ursula, power hungry, might not have the body to take over the board, but she does have the cost required to sing Be Prepared. And if your opponent gets to sing Be Prepared, they still have the ink left to take over the board they just wiped clear. When you're fighting for tempo, setting up and interacting with singers has the potential to swing the game, sometimes more than taking your value plays. I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned something from it. If you'd like to see more content like this, please let me know in the comments below what topics you'd like me to talk about. Thank you for watching. Have a magical day.